Our feet were not the first to touch this land. Our steps following a well-worn path. Footprints planted deep by those long, long ago. Our fathers, our mothers, our leaders, who long felt the cold whisper of snow as their eyes gazed out on this vast, beautiful expanse. That is our home. Those sacred hands, which for generations reached out and gathered the rich harvest, celebrating the bounty from the land and from the sea. Even then, so long ago, they saw us, knew us, led us, prepared us with wisdom, with knowledge, with foresight. Our lives echo with the wisdom of 1,000 years. Honor, respect, love for our people, our land, our traditions, our culture, even as our past breeds the future. Even as we turn our gaze to the horizon, we are still one people, a blessed people. We are Nupaq. We are ASRC. This is our story.
It is a story that begins more than 5,000 years ago. That's how long the Inupiat people have called Alaska's North Slope home. For as long as we have lived here, as well as the Canadian and Greenlandic Arctic, our lives and culture have been based on survival in conditions that would be intolerable to people living further to the south.
It was a good life. You survived. You went and got ice for drinking water. We got snow for washing.
When we were growing up, we were given responsibilities to help our parents.
Life was simple, but it was hard.
We walked long ways every day. We walked. We had no vehicles. We had no electricity, no running water, none of that.
In the morning, our house would be cold, no heat at all.
Life a long time ago was a lot more work than it is today.
You never realized that you had it tough because you were surviving.
Whaling was and continues to be central to Inupiat life and culture. Captains and crews, or EMMYS, working together for the benefit of their communities and their people. Traditions and skills handed down through millennia.
The ocean is our garden. Every day they had a hunt.
The whale is real significant to us because it sustained our way of life. Without the whale, Inupiat people wouldn't have anything to barter with other people like from the inland.
There's a sense of pride, when you're out whaling. It's pretty amazing because this is what God created, the bowhead, the people, and that's our gift. We consider it a gift, the whale.
We don't say that we hunt the animals. We believe the animals give themselves to us. We're connected with the animals. They come to us. They give themselves to us. Without them, we wouldn't have been here.
Whaling is a community event among our people. We all come together when the whales are spotted and crews head out on their journey. When we land a whale, we share it with our elders, our family, friends, and other families in the community. It is a joyous occasion that is celebrated. It's a time of great excitement because we have taken care of our people. We also relied heavily, as we still do, on caribou, salmon, walrus, and seal, along with waterfowl, as well as seasonal plants and berries. Iñupiaq was not a written language, so lessons and traditions were passed on through stories and practice. Woven into the language were Iñupiaq values, which have always been essential to our survival, as they embody practices and guidelines that make life possible in the Arctic, a harsh and challenging world. Respect, sharing, support for one another. It's who the Inupiat people are.
To me, it provides me a sense and pride to be able to convey our values.
Respecting each other, loving, avoidance of conflict. You know, those values that were brought down to us were already there.
Our people made their homes, tools, and clothes from available resources. In summer, they moved their families to hunting and fishing sites. The 19th century brought first contact with Westerners, beginning with a British ship in the mid-1820s.
Somehow this one whaling ship kind of came close to Cape Thompson and started coming along the coastline, kind of close to Tikilk, and finally they saw some stakes on the land and some ground mounds on Ningarok. To know what those stakes were whale bones, and those mounds on Ningarok were shot igloos. That's when they first find out about Point Hope, Tikilk.
The Westerners' discovery of the community of Point Hope opened a new industry in the Pacific, and by the 1840s, the first commercial whaling ships arrived from America seeking walrus and bowhead whales.
Whales, they rode whales as far as you could see. You could run on top of the water. A third of the world's fleet came up north. So they started catching these big whales. They were averaging 350 barrels from one whale. It started a rush.
When the rush began, by some accounts, the number of bowhead whales numbered around 60,000. By the early 1880s, within 40 short years, the walrus and bowhead had been nearly wiped out by commercial hunting. Though survival, for the most part, still depended on the ability to live off what the land and sea could provide, changes were coming for the eventual Americans of the Arctic. Under the 1867 Treaty of Cession with the government of Russia, the United States acquired what is now Alaska for $7.2 million, though neither country had any real right to claim ownership to native lands.
We occupied and used the land from time immemorial, never sold it to anyone, never lost it in any war.
Missionaries arrived on the North Slope in the late 1800s. Under their influence, the Iñupiaq people became less nomadic, settling in villages anchored by the missionary schools. In their zeal to civilize the Iñupiaq people, educating meant being flown from the comfort and familiarity of your own community to boarding schools.
When you're on the 8th grade, you have to do your best. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to hop on that airplane and go to high school.
Here, the lessons focused on the basics, all strictly taught in English.
When we were growing up, when we were little kids, Iñupiaq was a language at home. We spoke it very fluently, but we weren't very fluent in English.
The missionaries aggressively discouraged Iñupiaq language and traditions, and generally taught that Iñupiaq culture was inferior.
You know, a lot of our older elders are the ones that were forced to go to school elsewhere, that were forced to speak a language that they couldn't understand.
We would revert back to our pronunciations, and of course they laughed at us. And it took us a lot of years to get rid of that.
They were punished for speaking their own language, taken away from their home.
In the White House, President Eisenhower signs the proclamation that makes Alaska's entry into the Union official, nearly 92 years after Lincoln's Secretary of State bought the territory from the Russian Tsar for $7 million.
By the mid-20th century, Alaskans had begun their drive for statehood. Congress gave the new state of Alaska rights to about 104 million acres, promising to resolve native land rights sometime in the future. But as the state of Alaska began selecting its land without regard for native use and occupancy, our people quickly realized that in order to save our lands, we would have to fight for them.
I never did really understand what being a landlord was all about until I started reading books about the lower 48 states Indians, how they were treated. And I was determined then that this thing that happened in the lower 48 states would never happen to our people up here.
It was the push for Alaska statehood in the late 1950s that triggered a growing urgency for native land claims. As Inupiat, we have never claimed to own land. We have always had a relationship with the land and its resources that has little in common with Western notions of title. In fact, the very idea that the United States could purchase Alaska from Russia was a foreign concept. The land was not theirs to sell. The United States recognized this by saying Alaska natives still had title to their land based on Aboriginal use and occupancy.
The Statehood Act, to us, that was kind of foreign to us, what does Statehood Act mean? Well, I was part of the celebration. I didn't know what the hell I was celebrating about, but we were part of the United States.
Until statehood in 1959, all of Alaska's 375 million acres was federal land, and only a small amount of it had been transferred. The new state received rights to about 104 million acres. With native land rights unsettled, the state of Alaska began selecting its land without regard for native use and occupancy. When the state started cherry-picking lands in the Arctic, our people protested. It would be the discovery of crude at Prudhoe Bay in the late 60s and the ensuing pursuit of its development and transport to market across state and private land that pushed the need for urgency.
The oil companies were coming onto the North Slope. They were drilling without letting us know. The Inupiat people should have control over. It's like our leaders back then understood, if we don't get any of that land, we are going to get left behind.
Clearly, the issue had captured the attention of the federal government, whose leaders were faced with a harsh reality. Even though they were trying to reach agreements with different factions of the Alaska Native community, they surprisingly knew very little about them. A young law school graduate by the name of Bill Van Ness was tasked by none other than Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, the chair of the Interior and Insular Affairs Committee, to change that. Van Ness vividly remembered his marching orders.
I want you, young man, to come up with a legislative proposal and a strategy for taking care of that issue, which made me feel like I was on cloud nine, here, this great United States senator saying that I was going to be in charge of a big issue of importance to him.
After months of searching both state and federal resources, the quest for answers into the Alaska Native population came up empty. At the direction of Senator Jackson, a study was commissioned, and 6 months later, committee staff, senatorial staff, and even the White House had their long sought-after resource in the form of a first-of-its-kind publication put together by the Federal Field Commission.
Nobody knew anything at all about Alaska Native people. They didn't know how many villages they were. They didn't know where they were located. They had no understanding of the lifestyle these people were leading.
The book, Alaska Natives and the Land, was the first of its kind. 575 pages of statistics, maps, and social economic history cast Alaska's first residents in a whole new light and set the stage for the final passage of what would later be a landmark piece of legislation in Alaska.
We gave a copy to every member of the Senate and gave extra copies we had to the House We made copies available to the press, but in terms of what its impact was, there's a section in here that talks about what would be a framework for settlement of this Alaska Native claims, and it's right on in terms of what the ultimate Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act looked like after it had been adopted.
In 1965, Charles Edwardson Jr., Eduk, led the formation of Arctic Slope Native Association to claim legal ownership of the Arctic Slope area.
Charlie made an impression on everybody that he ran into. He was totally outspoken, totally believing in the equity of the Alaska Native Claims issue, totally believing that the oil companies and whoever the president was were ripping his people off, and that was just Charlie.
He was brilliant. He would have a legal theory to run by you, and it was hard to understand what his theory was. It was so detailed, and it was out of the box.
Other Native associations across the state were filing their own land claims. This momentum brought the Native groups together in 1966 to organize the Alaska Federation of Natives, or AFN. The timing of the Native land claims movement was critical. The same year, Interior Secretary Stuart Udall put a freeze on any land conveyances until the Native claims were settled.
This land freeze was so powerful and so important.
And the greatest thing that ever happened was the freezing of land, and there was no pipeline, which helped in the industry turning to our side, wanting to get that oil out.
They cannot do anything, until this land issue was resolved.
The stakes were suddenly much higher, and all sides, the Alaska Native community, the oil companies, and even the state of Alaska, turned up the heat on Congress to find answers.
This was another pressure point for there to be a settlement. The oil companies needed to get the oil to market. There were conservation groups that wanted new wildlife refuges, national parks, etc. So they wanted to see nothing happening from a developmental standpoint.
And our philosophy was, wealth comes from land. AFN at the time was ready to give in for 10 million acres and a bunch of money.
Once upon a time, you, the organized natives, almost made a fatal mistake. You almost demanded money, just money, for the extinguishment of your land rights.
We convinced them that more land was needed for, I guess at the time, 70,000, 100,000 natives in the state.
ASNA's leaders believed that because Prudhoe Bay was discovered on our land, it was our land that would bear the brunt of development. They felt that the terms of any land settlement, in fairness to the Inupiat, should recognize our ownership. It would take several more years before the final agreement, or the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, could be hammered out.
There were several versions of what became ANCSA alive in Congress. Some opted for more land to natives, some opted for less land, some opted for more money, some opted for less money.
There was general consensus that the settlement would consist of both land and money as payment for lands lost. Corporations would be established with individual natives as shareholders.
We had to remind Congress that the land claims fight was not going to be a welfare bill. This was a fight for the rights to our homeland, the right to develop your own resource is a human right.
Just how the land and money would be allocated among the native regions was not at all clear. Arctic Slope Native Association argued that the regions with the most land should receive the most land and money regardless of how many lived there.
For ASNA and for the Inupiat of the North Slope, this was a disaster because they had 5% of the total population.
In fact, for 3 months in 1970, ASNA withdrew from AFN in protest over the proposed distribution.
The Alaska Natives would never have had this land claim settlement had it not been for the Arctic Slope Native Association saying no. We said no and no.
Ladies and gentlemen of the AFN, this is the White House in Washington calling. I present the President of the United States.
I appreciate this opportunity to extend my greetings and best wishes to the convention of the Alaska Federation of Natives. I want you to be among the first to know that I have just signed the Alaska Native Claim Settlement Act.
The final settlement passed by Congress and signed by President Richard Nixon in December of 1971 was 44 million acres of land and $962.5 million in compensation for land lost. The land and compensation was shared among the 12 different regions represented by the Alaska Federation of Natives. Once again, ASNA was not completely happy with the final version and cast the only dissenting vote.
And I think the reason was we did not see enough land coming to our region in the act. 5 million acres out of 55 million acres claimed was not enough. And yet we abided by the terms of the act when it became law.
See, when the Claims Act was passed, we all said hooray. We became expert lobbyists and learned to tell our stories and refine them. Now we have to administer, from running dog teams to whaling to caribou hunting and subsistence lifestyle and fishing. All of a sudden now you're a businessman. When we incorporated, we all looked around at each other and said, now what the hell do we do?
President Richard Nixon signed the Alaska Native Claim Settlement Act, or ANCSA, into law on December 18, 1971. The act created 12 Alaska-based regional corporations and awarded Alaska Natives 44 million acres of land and nearly $1 billion compensation for the rest of the land lost. ANCSA also provided for about 200 village corporations within Alaska. Arctic Slope Native Association opposed the act as unfair, but once it was passed, the Arctic Slope leaders immediately set to work, building a corporation to represent the interests of the Inupiat people.
Do so by saying yea and raise your hand. Yea. Yea.
Arctic Slope Regional Corporation was incorporated June 22, 1972. Setting up a corporation from scratch was no easy task. There was no money to hire experts, no time for local leaders to get trained. Every native in the region who was alive on December 18, 1971 and had at least 1/4 native blood was eligible to enroll. Enrolling them meant reaching out to every household in every village. Joining Jacob Adams Sr. was Oliver Levitt, Nelson Avakana, and David Brower Sr., who were among those who went door to door, one by one.
It was kind of challenging and took a while because a lot of the families, we had to sit down with them and go through their family history.
Thanks to their efforts, by the time they had finished, more than 3,700 Inupiat had enrolled in ASRC.
Well, it wasn't exactly a goal of numbers, it was making sure that we don't miss anybody that would qualify as a shareholder for Arctic Slope Regional Corporation.
The early incorporating team had passion and conviction, but no experience in the sometimes confusing westernized structure of business.
Some of the difficult aspects of it was, how do we manage money? How do we go about getting a contract?
And it wasn't an easy task when your land claims are extinguished one day and you're forced into a Western corporate culture.
To help navigate through the choppy regulatory waters and better understand how the federal policy would affect the brand new Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, early leaders leaned on those who had successfully helped them get this far. The legal dream team included those who not only helped craft the language inside the Settlement Act, but also members who strongly believed in ASRC's mission. Among the team were attorneys Bill Van Ness, Alan Mintz, and Steve Seward. Also on the team was Jim Wickwire, the first American to summit K2.
He was kind of interesting because he was a mountain climber, and so we got to be very good friends over time, and he brought a lot of knowledge about the Claims Act, about land use issues.
And in those days, I don't think anybody could envision something like ASRC today emerging out of this. It was because it's hindsight is easy, but to look back and see where they started, what all they had was their strong belief that they were entitled to be treated fairly in this process. And to me, that was the driving force.
They made me a hero. I mean, everybody on the slope thought I did all these things. Well, here's the team that did it. And I tried to explain that. Of course, the cheers were for me. But here's the real guys right here. In Christ, I mean, let's not spill any beans here. It's just the straightforward truth that we've learned to trust each other. We became friends.
ASRC found another champion in a feisty World War II veteran who would go on to serve Alaska in the U.S. Senate for more than 40 years. Senator Ted Stevens left behind a legacy of fighting for Alaska Native self-determination that continues to this day.
Dad was focused on developing a bright future and preservation of traditional values. He was a visionary, I think, and he always wanted to see that there were people that were dreaming big and finding out ways to get to those goals. And the Alaska Native corporations were a foundation for all of that.
I've been involved in trying to help solve the Native land claims and the Native problems in the state for a long time. It was that act that gave people the ability to learn something about their heritage and everything else. It was the most unique act in the history of the Congress.
ASRC's share of the land was about 5.5 million acres, to be selected from 11 million acres. But much of the obvious land choices were locked up in the National Petroleum Reserve or the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.
Each community had their own land chief. The justification for selecting any lands were going to be either lands that are culturally important to us or lands with high resource development potential, or some combination of both.
Well, I would like to give our sincere thanks to the men of Barrow Fire Department and the crew members of the Naval Arctic Research Laboratory Fire Department for their tremendous efforts to save the building.
The work was hard enough without a new crisis. A fire broke out in the fall of 1975, destroying the building and all the original enrollment files.
You don't know, what are we going to do now? It's destroyed basically every piece of record we had. We basically had to kind of start over again.
By 1976, ASRC had selected all of its lands and was the first regional corporation to have its land conveyed. ASRC's initial conveyance was 3 million acres. ASRC was in business. Early subsidiaries of ASRC included Inupiat Builders, SKW Eskimos Inc., Arctic Slope Consulting Engineers, and Arctic Slope Alaska General. ASRC's goal for these businesses was to provide jobs and services to shareholders. In the late 70s and early 80s, ASRC signed oil and gas exploration leases with several oil companies. The leases provided the main source of ASRC's revenue as the subsidiaries got off the ground. Meanwhile, a big dispute broke out among the native corporations about one sentence of ANCSA, Section 7I.
It basically said that the subsurface revenues or revenues from timber, if you had timber on your lands, had to be shared with the other native corporations, regional corporations. But it didn't tell you how to do it. It didn't tell you whether they were gross revenues or net revenues.
The share with the other 11 land-based regional corporations ended up, after rounds of negotiations, at 70%. But questions remained about which revenues and which costs of development would be shared. The dispute was finally settled after the signing of the 1982 settlement agreement, which clarified some of the issues stemming from the original act. In a nutshell, if there was any element of subsurface in which you traded in the exchange, there would be a 7I consequence at the other end.
But if you were trading something that had absolutely no 7I consequences, which would be surface estate, you could trade it for anything, subsurface, whatever, and that would not be subject to 7I. And that was a critically important element of the Section 7I settlement agreement, which was another predicate of being able to do the Kaktovik exchange.
The exchange with the federal government traded surface estate in the gates of the Arctic National Park for subsurface beneath the village of Kaktovik, which is within the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR. The agreement brought in a new level of funding for ASRC, generating $24 million in lease bonuses in 1984, creating a new level of opportunity.
That allowed ASRC to pay $7 million of settlement costs that it had from litigation that it had lost over 7I sharing over the prior 6 or 7 years, but also provided them the additional cash that allowed them to start the new ASRC. With that, they bought Nachik, which is now ASRC Energy Services. They bought Petrostar. They started ASCG. It funded all of that initial growth in the business end of Arctic Slope.
ASRC was growing, and fast. It was during this time the early leaders were faced with a pivotal question: whether to include natives born after the passage of ANCSA as shareholders. As it stood, natives born after that could only inherit stock and were not enrolled directly.
What Congress did in 1987 was to make a provision that would allow a native corporation, if it so chooses, to open up its stock enrollment to those born after 1971.
It was recognized that siblings, the older siblings who were part of the corporation, younger siblings weren't.
Early leaders were on a mission to change that. The corporation at the time was only 15 years old, but made a bold decision that would dramatically affect the path of its future. In the end, the corporate bylaw to allow what's known as afterborns passed overwhelmingly, setting up a new and continuing generation of ASRC shareholders.
In order to keep in line with our values, it was a must. It had to be done. It's in line with our values to share, to be equal. It kept peace within our generations, kept peace within our people to work together.
You compare what ASRC has done to what any other private corporation in the world would do, where you have your shareholders voting to dilute their ownership interest in this corporation, which in ASRC's case represents the bulk of their net worth, and decide we're going to dilute that by 50% or whatever the number was, and at a growing dilution rate, and yet get 90% of the shareholders to vote for that. And it's just unheard of. Who would do that?
This was an easy argument to bring to the shareholders. We want inclusion, we want them to feel part of it, and that's why, for me, it was an easy push, because it's who we are as Inupiaq.
Open enrollment has placed pressure on ASRC to continue to pay meaningful dividends to an ever-growing number of shareholders. ASRC began with 3,700 shareholders. As of 2017, we have more than 13,000. It's a pool that grows between 2 and 3% each and every year. In 1978, ASRC issued its first shareholder dividend, $185,000 in all. As the corporation has grown steadily, so have the dividends. In 2017, ASRC surpassed the $1 billion mark in direct dividend payouts to its shareholders. Our economic success has been guided by a succession of visionary leaders, grounded by Inupiaq values handed down through generations.
It's important to work together. If you're a whaling captain, you've got a crew working together and you're successful. So we took that values that we had, that we transposed it to a corporation, that we work together, we don't hide anything from them, we are transparent.
It's all team effort, right? So you're not gonna be able to do anything by yourself. Just the same way as a whaling captain, you need to have the right people with the right skill set, right disciplines in the boat with you.
ASRC's business operations and investments evolved over time to take advantage of new opportunities. Today, we operate in 6 major business segments: government services, petroleum refining and marketing, energy support services, industrial services, construction, and resource development. Through our subsidiary, ASRC Federal, we provide a broad range of engineering, professional, and technical services for the U.S. government in areas including space, aviation, and missile defense, along with base and range operations, R&D, security, and financial management. In 2016, ASRC Federal acquired Vistronics Intelligence and Technology Solutions and its 700 employees in Reston, Virginia. And like all our subsidiaries, ASRC Federal is focused on providing job opportunities for our shareholders.
So many of our shareholders start often at lower level internship type positions, some of whom work their way into permanent positions, and through completing their education or working their way through the system in increasingly larger roles and responsibilities, the shareholders develop opportunities to go and advance throughout our organization.
Petrostar Inc. is the only Alaska-owned refining and fuel marketing company in the state. We provide gasoline and heating oil for Alaskans, along with jet fuel for Eielson Air Force Base. In Valdez, we produce low-sulfur diesel and marine fuels for coastal communities as far away as the Pribilof Islands, and servicing the largest commercial fishing fleet in America.
Petrostar and Arctic Slope have a very, very long history. Arctic Slope has been the sole owner of Petrostar now for going on 30 years. They were the missing link, if you will, that allowed Petrostar to exist as a company. They provided the guarantee of the financing.
ASRC Energy Services is Alaska's largest oil field services company with more than 3,200 employees, providing engineering, operations, maintenance, and fabrication. With operations stretching from Alaska to Louisiana, AES provides services to the world's largest energy companies. And our success in the oil services businesses has provided both direct and indirect benefits to our shareholders.
The impact to our shareholders is really twofold. One is job opportunities, and secondly is dividend generation. Until you've gone out and gone into a grocery store in a remote community and you see that a jar of peanut butter is $16, it's hard to get your mind around what does it cost these days to live in a community you grew up in and your ancestors grew up in. So the economic engine of the dividend is very important to shareholders who are trying to remain in their communities that they were born and raised in. And then job opportunities that are rotational so they can also have a paycheck to take back into the community and be part of its economic engine.
In 2016, AES finished construction on Prudhoe Bay's most advanced automated service warehouse, ensuring AES crews and equipment are prepared for any challenge. It didn't take long for the new facility to become the envy of other oil field support companies on the North Slope.
We literally took everything that we thought was the best of the best and put it into the design plans for this facility. They got overhead cranes, we got lifts for everything other than track equipment. Basically, we can lift up heavy trucks, light vehicles. We can wash them and clean them before they got to work on them. All of that is going to be a huge improvement in productivity and personnel morale. It's really an amazing place.
Our acquisition of Little Red Services, a leading oil field service provider for more than 30 years, reinforces the mission statement of AES, One Crew, One Journey. In 2016, ASRC also established ASRC Industrial Services, or AIS, a new holding company headquartered in Concord, California. Its first subsidiary, Petrochem, was founded in 1974 to meet the insulation needs of the petrochemical industry. Today, Petrochem provides insulation, metal structures, fireproofing, and other specialty services for a wide range of industries through 7 regional offices around the United States. In 2016, AIS also acquired Restoration Services Incorporated, based in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a recognized leader in the field of restoration and development of industrial land and promotion of renewable energy. ASRC Construction Holding Company provides oversight and support services to 3 construction companies: SKW Eskimos Inc., ASRC Civil Construction, and ASRC Builders LLC. We are builders, constructing schools and hospitals for our community, runways and hangars for military and civilian aviation, and energy-efficient buildings for industry. Not to mention America's northernmost luxury hotel, the Top of the World Hotel in our hometown of Utqeqvik. As landowners, ASRC continues to pursue responsible resource development consistent with the protection of our subsistence heritage. We continue to participate in exploration activities both directly and indirectly on the North Slope. Our royalty position on the Colville River Unit has provided benefits and revenue to our shareholders through the ongoing development at the ConocoPhillips Alpine Field. ASRC's vision and success in the energy sector has also paid dividends to other regional corporations totaling more than $1 billion. Our commitment to providing opportunity for all Alaskans led us to form Alaska Growth Capital, now a recognized leader in small business lending for underserved areas of rural Alaska. In 2014, AGC was recognized as the Alaska Small Business Administration's Community Lender of the Year.
We fill a very important market between bank financing and equity financing for small businesses throughout Alaska, and now serving 6 western United States.
And we still operate Tundra Tours, one of our very first business ventures. ASRC actively works to provide meaningful career opportunities and career development for shareholders in our corporate offices and subsidiaries. By the year 2000, ASRC had achieved the board's goal of earning $1 billion in revenues. Just 8 years later, revenues had doubled to $2 billion. In 2015, revenues exceeded $2.5 billion, making ASRC the largest locally owned and operated private corporation in Alaska.
I've always felt that that's why ASRC has been so successful. You know, growing up in my community, watched from afar, watched our leaders, and most of those leaders were whaling captains. Spiritual, they put God first, but there's an actual hierarchy in how things are done. You got to get your crew home safe. You want to feed people. So in the business world, it's basically the same.
ASRC is dedicated to preserving the Inupiaq way of life. To help preserve subsistence hunting and fishing, ASRC revised its policies in the early 1990s to formally allow employees time off for subsistence activities. Not only are cultural activities encouraged for the employees, they are encouraged and practiced by members of the board. Inupiaq values have remained the key to success for ASRC.
All of our values, which have been taught to us by our elders, are interconnected in one way or another. You start to look at harvesting an animal as big as a whale. You take that same principle of working together into your business, you can't go wrong.
As a company owned and operated by Inupiaq, ASRC relies on the teachings of our ancestors. We live by the values passed on through countless generations. Our core values are respect for elders and one another. Elders are revered in Inupiaq culture. we strive to extend that deep respect to others as well. Respect for nature. Inupiat survival has depended on nature and its resources. We have deep respect for what nature provides us. Compassion. Compassion for others is essential for Inupiat survival. Humility. Humility is an important thread in the fabric of Inupiat society. It ensures that we keep our own personal importance in perspective and helps us guard against the destructive effects of arrogance and pride. Humor. The Inupiat place great value on humor as one of the everyday joys of life. Cooperation. Cooperation is the foundation of Inupiat survival. Sharing. Acts of giving always come back. Family and kinship. We believe in knowing who we are and how we are related. Knowledge of language. Knowledge of Inupiat language bolsters our identity. Spirituality. The Inupiat are a spiritual people who value the power of prayer. Avoidance of conflict. The Inupiat way is to think positive, act positive, speak positive, and live positive. These core values are the cornerstone of our success as a company. Inupiat values guide us as we manage our business operations, lands, resources, and business relationships.
You know, Inupiat values are very important to our people. We'll use our culture to shape the philosophy of the corporation.
It's never about you. It was made very clear to me by my parents, Alan and Francis. Never. You are a servant. You're here to provide for the widows, the elders, and those in need. And whatever you do in life, he would tell me that be strong, be proud, have that discipline, but be very humble.
At ASRC, we live our values. We established an Elders Benefit Trust to provide support for original ASRC shareholders 65 and older. In 1977, we created the Arctic Education Foundation to provide college scholarships as well as other educational opportunities to eligible shareholders. Every year, hundreds of young Inupiat students are provided the chance to continue their education.
I think it's a testament to how the Alaska Native Corporations and ASRC really makes a commitment to things like education to ensure that you're improving the lives of people in the community so that you can have the leaders for tomorrow.
I'm only the second person in my family to graduate from college, and that's opened a lot of doors, and I know it's made my family very proud. There's a really good chance that without the funding AEF has provided throughout the years that I would not have been able to go through college or to finish my degree.
The students of today are undoubtedly the leaders of tomorrow. And that I said that some 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's still true today.
Arctic Slope Regional Corporation was incorporated in June of 1972. And has grown into the largest, most successful locally owned and operated business in Alaska. It's a title ASRC has held for more than 20 consecutive years.
Well, I think we have done a job as well as expected. It took us a long time getting here, but I think we have arrived.
We've grown to this capacity as one of the top companies in Alaska, not by chance. It's been by design.
Even in its formative years, the eyes of this corporation were fixed on the horizon, and that hasn't changed. At ASRC, the responsibility of today's leaders is to identify those of tomorrow.
A day doesn't go by that when I travel, I'm looking. We're constantly looking everywhere we go. We listen, we hear, we look in high school, we go all the way down. I believe that that's what they did. Jake and Oliver, they looked and they saw and they selected some, and we will continue to do that. That's something that, that's near and dear to my heart.
ASRC's role as a corporate leader is on display every day in classrooms and boardrooms across Alaska, as well as at work sites across America. As we continue to expand, diversify, and grow, we are sharing the story of our corporation through the expression of our values.
I am a father. And like my father before me, I have dreams, I have vision. I am a hunter with a deep respect for nature. I have a responsibility to my family, and here we are all family. I live in a place where my father lived, but not as my father lived. And like my father before me, I am Inupiaq. I am ASRC, strengthening Alaska through our values.
Proud of our history, still focused on our mission to actively manage our businesses, our lands and resources, our investments, and our relationships to enhance Inupiaq cultural and economic freedom with continuity, responsibility, and integrity. At ASRC, we have come so far from such humble beginnings. For the corporation, a never-ending journey to provide opportunity and benefits for our people and our North Slope communities. And this is only the start.
So I think we've reached that point where we can look to the future and say, okay, this is the process we're going to follow to continue to be successful in our endeavors in being profitable, and that our shareholders benefit from the continued efforts of the management and board of directors of ASRC.
And so, we stride ever forward, together, as one people, with our past grounding us. Humble, respectful, we look to the horizon with anticipation, to a future lined with hope and promise. We are resilient, rooted in culture, steeped in tradition, yet adaptable, and a part of something powerful and new. Those who walk this same path so very long ago, who leaned into the storm with strength and guided us with Inupiaq values, prepared us to survive, thrive, and innovate in the midst of the harsh Arctic environment. Today, as we continue down this well-marked trail, we are prepared for the new, ever-evolving world. A digital, connected world. Yet at the heart of it, we are who we always have been, a proud link in the unbroken chain that stretches from the distant past to our future. This is true north. We are now the example to those who come after us, guiding with wisdom, raising the standard. We will not turn back. We will face our challenges with grace, strength, and integrity. As always, holding our values and our people close. We are Inupiaq. We are ASRC.
I am a mother, and like my mother before me, I pass on to my children the values of my people, respect for our elders, the gift of sharing, and the importance of family. And like my mother before me, I can be whatever I want to be: an artist, a business leader, a captain. I am EMMYS, and I am ASRC. ASRC, strengthening Alaska through our values.
I live in the village of Wainwright, on the coast of the Chukchi Sea. The traditional name for our village is Olonek. Our people have thrived here for millennia. Keeping our Inupiat values and traditions, we are able to embrace change. I am a member of a whaling crew, a dancer, and a teacher. I am Inupiat, and we are ASRC, strengthening Alaska through our values.
Point Hope has been here for thousands of years. The Point Hope people, we live a cycle of life that has been passed to us from one generation to another. It's a real rich history, a rich culture. Everything is centered around the whale. The ocean is our garden. We don't say that we hunt the animals, we believe the animals give themselves to us. Today we are 900 strong.
I am EMMYS. We are ASRC, strengthening Alaska through our values.
I grew up in the village of Tikeraluk in a sod house on the banks of the Mead River, and we survived on fish and caribou. Eventually, the schools closed and we were forced to move away. But in the 1970s, we reestablished the village and called it Atkasuk. Over 250 people live here now. We still hunt the caribou. I am EMMYS, and we are ASRC, strengthening Alaska through our values.
I am a child of the Arctic. I stand on the shoulders of
those who came before me. Raised by tradition, I will succeed for my family, for my community, for myself. I share
all that I've learned with those who will follow.
And what I do here
will have an impact around the world.
I am
EMMYS, and I am ASRC. ASRC, strengthening Alaska through our values.
My home resides in the furthest northern community in America. The Inupiaq has shared this land for generations. Long before statehood, this area attracted whalers and traders. Recently, my community changed its name from Barrow to Utqiagvik. Our history and culture still revolves around whaling and paying respect to nature. I'm EMMYS, and we are ASRC, strengthening Alaska through our values.